The millionaire husband humiliated his wife for being in a wheelchair. "Damn you, you're useless." What happened brought him to his knees. Henry Westwood had spent his entire life crafting an empire built on power, influence, and appearance. He wasn't just another wealthy businessman. He was a force. People admired him, feared him, envied him. His presence commanded respect, and his name alone could open doors most men wouldn't even dare knock on. He had everything a man like him could ever want: a multi-million-dollar corporation, a lavish mansion, luxury cars, and a flawless wife who stood by his side like the perfect accessory. Rebecca Westwood was stunning, graceful, elegant, and most importantly, obedient. She never questioned Henry's authority, never embarrassed him in public, never did anything that might tarnish the pristine image he worked so hard to maintain. To Henry, their marriage wasn't about love. It was about control. He saw her as a trophy, a representation of his success, someone to smile at his side during social events and make other men jealous. Tonight was no different. The Westwoods were attending an exclusive charity gala, the kind of event where billionaires gathered to flaunt their generosity while sipping champagne that cost more than an average person's mortgage. Henry walked in with his usual confidence, nodding at familiar faces, shaking hands with business partners and flashing his signature smirk. Rebecca, dressed in a stunning black gown, followed him, her smile practiced and poised. "Henry, my friend," a booming voice called out as Richard Langford, a fellow business magnate, approached. "Always the man of the hour," Henry chuckled, shaking Langford's hand firmly. "Richard, good to see you." Langford's gaze flickered to Rebecca. "And, as always, your wife is a vision." Henry smirked, placing a hand on the small of Rebecca's back. "Of course she is. What would a man like me be without a woman like her?" Rebecca kept her smile intact, though she felt the sting of his words. It wasn't the first time Henry spoke about her as if she were a possession, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. As the evening went on, Henry moved through the room like royalty, his every step filled with confidence. Deals were discussed, alliances were strengthened, and power plays were made, all under the glow of crystal chandeliers. This was his world, and he thrived in it. But for Rebecca, it was suffocating. She had grown used to playing the role of the perfect wife, but there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when she wondered what it would be like to live outside of Henry's shadow. "Excuse me for a moment," she whispered to him, stepping away toward the balcony to get some air. She exhaled slowly, looking over the city skyline. It was beautiful, glittering, endless, a world full of possibilities, just not for her. Thinking about running away. The deep voice made her turn. It was Daniel Carter, one of Henry's business rivals. Unlike Henry, Daniel had a reputation for fairness, for treating people with respect, and for never letting greed consume him. Rebecca smiled lightly. If only that were an option. Daniel studied her for a moment. "It is, you know, you're not as trapped as you think." She let out a soft laugh. "You don't know Henry. Leaving isn't that simple." Daniel's expression darkened slightly. "No, I suppose it wouldn't be." Before she could respond, Henry appeared at the balcony door, his sharp gaze fixed on Daniel. "Am I interrupting something?" His tone was casual, but there was a cold edge beneath it. Daniel simply smirked. "Not at all, Henry. Just having a friendly conversation with your wife." Henry's jaw tightened. "Rebecca, inside now." Rebecca didn't argue. She knew better. Without another word, she walked past Henry, feeling the weight of his anger, as she stepped back into the gala. The rest of the night passed in a blur. But when they got home, Henry's fury boiled over. "What the hell were you doing talking to Carter?" His voice was low, dangerous. Rebecca sighed, already exhausted. "It was nothing, Henry. Just small talk." Henry stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Small talk? You don't talk to men like him. Do you understand me?" She swallowed. Nodding, there was no point in arguing. Henry always had to be right. As he loosened his tie and poured himself a drink, he smirked. "You know, Rebecca, sometimes I wonder if you truly understand how lucky you are. You have everything. A husband who provides, a life of luxury, a place in society. Some women would kill for that." Rebecca forced a smile, the same way she always did. "Yes, Henry, I know." But deep down, she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending. Henry, however, remained blissfully unaware. In his mind, life was perfect. His empire was untouchable. His status was secure. And his wife would always remain exactly where he wanted her, by his side, silent and obedient. But fate had other plans, and soon, everything Henry Westwood believed to be permanent would come crashing down. The rain pounded against the windshield as Rebecca stared out at the darkened streets. The city lights blurred together. Distorted by the droplets clinging to the glass, it was late, later than she wanted to be out. But Henry had insisted they stay at the gala until the very end. He had been in one of his moods, reveling in the attention, soaking in every bit of admiration from his peers. Now, as their driver maneuvered through the slick roads, Henry sat beside her, scrolling through his phone, barely acknowledging her presence. He had been unusually quiet since they left the event, and Rebecca knew why. He was still seething about Daniel Carter. "You embarrassed me tonight," he muttered, not looking up from his screen. Rebecca sighed. "I didn't do anything." "Henry, it was just a conversation." Henry's grip tightened around his phone. "Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I don't know when another man is sniffing around my wife?" She turned to face him. Daniel wasn't. "Enough!" His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "You don't get to argue with me about this." Rebecca clenched her jaw, staring at him, willing herself to remain calm. This wasn't the first time Henry had accused her of something ridiculous, and it wouldn't be the last. She knew better than to fight back. The driver, sensing the tension in the car, kept his eyes fixed on the road, saying nothing. They continued in silence. The only sound, the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers and the distant hum of the city. Then, out of nowhere, headlights appeared, bright, blinding. Too close. The driver cursed under his breath, jerking the wheel violently to the right as a speeding truck barreled toward them. The tires screeched against the wet pavement, and for a split second Rebecca felt weightless. The world spun. Then, impact. The force of the crash sent the car rolling. Rebecca's body was thrown violently against the seatbelt as metal twisted and glass shattered around her. She heard Henry's voice, shouting, cursing, but everything was a blur. The deafening crunch of metal, the sensation of being tossed like a rag doll, the suffocating smell of gasoline and burning rubber, and then darkness. When Rebecca opened her eyes, the world was painfully bright. White walls, fluorescent lights, the steady beep of machines. Her head throbbed. Her body felt heavy. She was in a hospital, blinking against the haze. She tried to move, but a sharp pain shot up her back. Panic surged through her as she turned her head, searching for something, someone, to anchor her to reality. Then she saw him. Henry sat in the chair beside her bed, his expression unreadable. His suit was rumpled. His tie loosened, and for a moment he almost looked concerned. But as soon as their eyes met, that concern vanished, replaced by something colder. "Good," he said flatly. "You're awake." Rebecca swallowed, her throat dry. "What happened?" Henry leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "The driver was killed," he said, as if reading from a report. "The other car sped off. No witnesses. The police think it was a hit and run." Rebecca let that sink in, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. The driver, gone, just like that. And yet, she and Henry had survived. She tried to shift, to sit up, but the pain was excruciating. Her body refused to cooperate. Her breathing quickened. "Rebecca," Henry's tone was sharp, impatient. "Don't panic." But she was panicking. She forced herself to move again, willing her legs to respond. Nothing. The machines beeped faster. Her hands gripped the sheets. "Henry!" A doctor entered the room before she could say another word. "Mrs. Westwood," he greeted, his face professionally neutral. "How are you feeling?" Rebecca struggled for words. I can't move my legs." The doctor nodded solemnly. "I need you to remain calm." "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, something's wrong." Henry exhaled sharply. "Just tell her." The doctor hesitated before speaking. "The crash caused severe trauma to your spine. The damage, it's extensive at this point. We don't know if—" Rebecca's vision blurred. The rest of the doctor's words faded into static. "Spinal trauma. Extensive damage. Possible paralysis." Paralysis. The word settled over her like a death sentence. She turned to Henry, searching his face, hoping for some sign of reassurance. But he didn't look at her with concern. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't tell her everything would be okay. Instead, he stood, adjusting his suit jacket. "I'll let you rest," he said, his tone devoid of emotion, and then he walked out. The days passed in a blur of tests, nurses, and quiet devastation. Rebecca barely spoke. She barely ate. Every time she tried to move, her reality crushed her all over again. Henry rarely visited. When he did, he never stayed long. He never asked how she was feeling, never brought her flowers, never touched her. The warmth that once existed between them, no matter how small, was gone. One evening, as she lay staring at the ceiling, Henry finally spoke the words she had feared the most. "You need to accept that things have changed." Rebecca looked at him, her throat tightening. "Henry, He cut her off. "I didn't marry an invalid." "Rebecca!" She flinched. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I have a reputation to uphold. I can't have people looking at me with pity. I won't be the man whose wife is—" He waved his hand dismissively, unable to even finish the sentence. Rebecca felt the sting of his words like a slap. The man she had devoted her life to, the man she had stood by through everything, was now looking at her as if she were nothing. She had lost her legs, and now she was losing her husband too. The days blurred into weeks, and Rebecca remained in the hospital, trapped in a body that no longer obeyed her. Every morning, she woke up hoping it had all been a bad dream, but the weight of reality settled in as soon as she tried to move her legs. The nurses were kind, the doctors professional, but none of them could give her the answer she desperately needed. When, or if, she would walk again, Henry visited less and less. At first, he had excuses: work, meetings, urgent business matters. But soon, he didn't even bother pretending. Some days, he didn't show up at all. When he did, his presence was colder than the sterile white walls around her. One evening, he arrived late, dressed in an immaculate suit, the faint scent of whiskey on his breath. Rebecca, who had spent the entire day staring at the ceiling, turned her head to look at him. "You were out," she said quietly. Henry didn't bother denying it. He loosened his tie, sighing. "I had a dinner meeting." Rebecca studied him. "You mean a gala, another charity event, another excuse to pretend everything is perfect?" His jaw tightened. "What do you expect me to do?" "Rebecca, lock myself away in this hospital with you." She flinched at the sharpness of his tone, but she didn't back down. "I expect my husband to be here for me." Henry scoffed, running a hand through his hair. "Rebecca, be reasonable. Do you really think people aren't talking? Do you know how many questions I've had to answer?" She stared at him in disbelief. "Questions? About what?" He turned to face her fully, his expression cold. "About you. About us. About how the mighty Henry Westwood's wife is now different." The word hung in the air like poison. "Different." Rebecca's chest tightened. "So that's what this is about, your reputation." Henry exhaled slowly, as if he were speaking to a child. "I have an image to uphold. Investors, board members, social circles. They all watch, they all judge, and now they pity me." Her stomach twisted. "Pity you?" He didn't even hesitate. "Yes. Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to have people whisper about how my wife has become a burden?" The word hit like a slap. Burden? Rebecca felt something inside her crack. She had feared Henry's indifference, dreaded his growing absence, but this was worse. This was contempt. A sharp knock interrupted them. A nurse entered with a warm smile, oblivious to the tension. "Mrs. Westwood, it's time for your physical therapy." Rebecca turned to Henry, hoping, foolishly, that he would say something, offer some kind of support, but he simply checked his watch. "I have to go," he muttered, already heading for the door. Rebecca watched him leave, a hollow feeling spreading through her. Therapy was excruciating. Every attempt to move felt like a battle against a body that refused to cooperate. The physical therapist, a woman named Linda, was patient but firm. "You're stronger than you think," Linda encouraged as Rebecca struggled to push herself up. Rebecca let out a humorless laugh. "That's funny. My husband seems to think the opposite." Linda didn't respond immediately. Instead, she handed Rebecca a resistance band. "You need to decide something, Rebecca. Are you going to let this define you? Or are you going to fight for yourself?" Rebecca swallowed hard. She didn't have an answer. Days passed. Henry stopped coming altogether. At first, She told herself he was busy, that he'd show up eventually, but deep down, she knew the truth. He was avoiding her. The final proof came when she saw a gossip magazine left in the waiting area. On the front cover was a picture of Henry at yet another exclusive event, his arm around a beautiful woman in a red dress. The headline read, "Henry Westwood moving on." Rebecca felt sick. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. There were more photos. Henry laughing, drinking, whispering into the woman's ear. The article speculated that he had been seen with multiple women, enjoying the social scene as if nothing had changed. He wasn't just neglecting her, he was erasing her. When Henry finally showed up, 3 days later, Rebecca didn't bother hiding the magazine. It sat open on her lap when he walked in. He glanced at it briefly before shrugging. "You shouldn't believe everything you read." Rebecca's voice was eerily calm. "Tell me it's not true." Henry didn't answer. She clenched her fists. "I'm still your wife, Henry." He let out a bitter laugh. "Are you?" Silence. Rebecca stared at him, waiting for him to take it back, to tell her he didn't mean it. But he didn't. Something inside her shattered completely. "You're a coward," she whispered. Henry's expression darkened. "Careful, Rebecca." She lifted her chin. "Or what? You'll leave me?" She let out a hollow laugh. "Oh, wait, you already have." Henry didn't even look guilty. He simply adjusted his cuffs, as if her words were nothing more than an inconvenience. "I'll have someone take care of your hospital bills," he said, as if that made everything better. "I'll make sure you have what you need." Rebecca stared at him, her throat tight. "I don't need your money." Henry smirked. "We both know that's not true." Then, without another word, he walked out. For good. Rebecca didn't cry. She wanted to. God, she wanted to break down. To scream, to throw something, but she didn't. Instead, she reached for the magazine again, staring at the image of Henry smiling with another woman. That was the moment she realized something. Henry had already moved on, and now, it was time for her to do the same. The hospital room felt colder than usual. Rebecca sat by the window, staring at the city beyond the glass, watching as life continued without her. People moved freely on the streets, unaware of the woman sitting alone, trapped in a body she no longer recognized. It had been a week since Henry walked out for the last time. At first, she had hoped, despite everything, that he would come back, even if only to say goodbye properly. But he hadn't. He never called, never sent a message. The man she had once called her husband had vanished from her life as if she had never existed. Good, at least now. She knew where she stood. The bitterness sat in her chest like a stone, but beneath it, something else had begun to take root, something she hadn't felt in a long time: determination. She glanced down at her legs, still motionless beneath the thin hospital blanket. Every time she looked at them, she felt a mix of grief and frustration. But she wasn't going to let them define her, not anymore. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Linda, her physical therapist, stepped inside with a warm but firm smile. "Time for therapy, Mrs. Westwood." Rebecca let out a slow breath. She hated therapy. It was humiliating, painful, and exhausting. But if she wanted her life back, if she wanted to be more than what Henry had left behind, she had to push through it. With Linda's help, she transferred into the wheelchair and was taken to the therapy room. It was a quiet space, equipped with parallel bars, resistance bands, and exercise mats. Other patients were there too, each fighting their own battle. Rebecca rolled up to the parallel bars, her stomach tightening. She had tried before, tried and failed, but today had to be different. Linda kneeled in front of her. "We're going to take it one step at a time. No pressure, no expectations. Just try." Rebecca nodded, gripping the bars with trembling hands. She took a deep breath and pushed against the armrests, trying to lift herself. Her arms shook, her legs felt like dead weight. For a moment, she thought she would collapse back into the chair. Then she remembered Henry's voice. "I didn't marry an invalid, Rebecca." Something inside her snapped. She clenched her jaw and pushed harder, gritting her teeth as she forced her body upward. Her muscles screamed, her arms burned, and for a second, it felt impossible. But then, she was standing, her knees wobbled, and Linda quickly steadied her. But she was up. She wasn't sitting. She wasn't powerless. She was standing. A lump formed in her throat. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she looked straight ahead, holding onto the bars as if her life depended on it. Linda smiled. "That's it, Rebecca. That's the first step." Rebecca exhaled shakily, her fingers tightening around the cold metal. It wasn't a real step. It wasn't walking. But it was something, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like she had control over her own life again. She wasn't done, not even close. Days passed, and Rebecca pushed herself harder. Every session in the therapy room was grueling, but she refused to give up. She had spent too much of her life being the perfect, obedient wife, molding herself to fit Henry's expectations. Not anymore. She was going to rebuild herself, with or without the use of her legs. One evening after an intense session, she sat alone in her room, scrolling mindlessly through her phone. She hadn't touched social media in weeks. She hadn't wanted to see Henry's face plastered across events with his new women. But something else caught her eye. A video of a young woman in a wheelchair giving a speech about fashion. Rebecca clicked on it, curious. The woman spoke with confidence, sharing her struggles and triumphs. She talked about how difficult it was to find clothing that was both stylish and functional for people with disabilities. How the fashion industry ignored them, how they deserved to be seen. Rebecca's breath hitched. Fashion, she had always loved it. Before Henry, before the world of business and corporate functions, she had dreamed of designing, but she had given it up, because Henry said it was a hobby, not a career. Now, for the first time, she wondered, what if she hadn't given it up? What if she could build something for herself, something no one could take away? The idea rooted itself in her mind, growing stronger by the second. She grabbed a notepad from the bedside table and started sketching. It had been years since she had drawn anything, but the moment the pen touched paper, it all came back. Her lines were rough, her hands unsteady, but she could see it. The vision forming right in front of her, a clothing line, designed specifically for people like her, people who had been overlooked, people who deserved more. She had been told she was useless, that she had nothing left, but she was about to prove them all wrong, and Henry Westwood would regret every single word he had ever said to her. Henry Westwood had always considered himself untouchable. He built his empire with ruthless precision, securing power through carefully calculated deals, strategic alliances, and an image of unshakable dominance. In his mind, his wealth was permanent, his influence absolute, but nothing lasts forever. The first sign of trouble came in the form of whispers at an exclusive club where the city's wealthiest men gathered to drink overpriced whiskey and discuss business. Henry overheard snippets of conversation that made his stomach tighten. Not looking good for Westwood Industries. He put too much faith in the wrong people. Word is, his board is getting restless. Henry clenched his jaw, forcing a smirk as he approached the group. "Gentlemen," he greeted smoothly, swirling the glass in his hand, "care to enlighten me on these little rumors?" The men exchanged glances before one of them. Grant Whitmore, an old rival, chuckled. "Oh, come on, Henry. You must have heard by now. Your stock is plummeting. Investors are getting nervous. Your board is, well, let's just say they're weighing their options." Henry's grip tightened around his glass. "Bullshit." Grant smirked. "Suit yourself." Henry left the club early that night, a pit forming in his stomach. He had dismissed the rumors at first, confident that his company was untouchable. But as the days passed, the cracks in his empire began to widen. Stock prices continued to drop. Investors grew hesitant. Deals that once seemed guaranteed began to slip through his fingers. And then came the betrayal. It started with a private meeting. Henry's most trusted business partners, men he had known for years, requested an urgent discussion. He walked into the boardroom expecting to hear about another financial setback. Nothing he couldn't fix. Instead, he was met with icy stares. "We need to talk, Henry." There was something in their tone that made his skin crawl. "You've put us in a difficult position," one of them, Mitchell Harris, said. "Your personal matters are affecting business. Investors are pulling out." Henry's lips curled in irritation. "You're blaming me for the market's instability. Your reputation is tarnished," another man interjected. "The divorce, the scandal, the headlines, none of it is helping." Henry's fists clenched. He had spent years building these relationships, securing loyalty through power and wealth. Now they were turning on him. "I can fix this," he said through gritted teeth. Mitchell exchanged a glance with the others. "That's the problem, Henry. You can't." A heavy silence fell over the room before someone slid a document across the table. Henry glanced down, and then his blood ran cold. It was a buyout proposal, one that would remove him from his own company. "You're pushing me out," he realized, voice low with barely contained fury. Mitchell exhaled, looking almost sympathetic. "It's already done, Henry. The board voted. We're just giving you the courtesy of stepping down voluntarily." Henry's vision blurred with rage. "You bastards!" He shoved the document back. Standing so abruptly, his chair scraped against the floor. "You think you can do this to me?" "It's not personal," Mitchell said. "It's business." Henry let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You sound just like me." No one spoke. He turned on his heel and stormed out. For the first time in his life, Henry Westwood was powerless. He spent the next few days locked in his penthouse, drinking heavily, making desperate phone calls, trying to salvage what little control he had left. But the world had already decided his fate. News of his downfall spread quickly. His name, once spoken with admiration and fear, became a cautionary tale. His assets were frozen as legal battles ensued. His high society friends distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with a sinking ship. And then, as if fate hadn't punished him enough, his mistress left him. She didn't even have the decency to do it in private. The headlines were everywhere. Henry Westwood's new flame jumps ship, spotted with business rival. Henry threw his phone against the wall, shattering it. Everything. He had lost everything. Days turned into weeks, and his once flawless world crumbled around him. His mansion, his cars, his reputation, gone one by one. His possessions were seized, his accounts drained. He had mocked Rebecca for being a burden, but now he was the one with nothing left. Sitting in his now empty penthouse, surrounded by expensive furniture that no longer belonged to him, Henry poured himself another drink. His hands trembled. His reflection in the window mocked him. A man who had once stood at the top, now reduced to nothing more than a washed-up has-been. His mind wandered to Rebecca. He had left her in a hospital bed, thinking she would never recover, thinking she would wither without him. But what if? What if she was doing better than him? The thought burned. He had no one else to turn to. No allies. No money. So for the first time in his life, Henry Westwood swallowed his pride, and he went back to the one person who once loved him. He went back to Rebecca. Rebecca hadn't thought about Henry in weeks. She had buried herself in physical therapy, determined to regain as much independence as possible. On the days when her body refused to cooperate, when her arms ached from pulling herself up, she pushed harder. She had to. The image of Henry walking out on her, the weight of his words, "I didn't marry an invalid," still lingered in the back of her mind. But she wasn't an invalid, and she wasn't broken. Her sketches were coming to life, with the help of a few contacts she had made during her time in high society. She had started turning her designs into prototypes, clothing designed for people like her, elegant, practical, beautiful. For the first time in her life, Rebecca was building something that was hers. And then, just when she thought she had erased Henry from her thoughts, he showed up. She was in the middle of a meeting at a small studio she had rented when her assistant, Sophie, rushed in, looking flustered. "There's a man outside asking to see you," Sophie said hesitantly. Rebecca barely looked up from the fabric samples. "Tell him to make an appointment." Sophie hesitated. "It's Henry Westwood." Rebecca froze. The room went silent. She felt the eyes of the designers on her, waiting for a reaction. But Rebecca was no longer the woman Henry had left in that hospital bed. She was stronger now, more powerful than he could ever imagine. She calmly set down the fabric and smoothed her blouse before glancing at Sophie. "Send him in." A murmur rippled through the room. Everyone knew who Henry was, what he had done to her, but no one questioned her decision. A few moments later, the door opened, and Henry stepped inside. Rebecca barely recognized him. Gone was the confident, untouchable businessman who once controlled every room he entered. The man standing before her looked tired. His suit, though expensive, hung slightly loose, as if he had lost weight. His once pristine appearance was overshadowed by the shadows under his eyes. But what struck her most was the hesitation in his posture. Henry Westwood had never hesitated before. Rebecca remained seated. If Henry expected her to rush to greet him, he was sorely mistaken. "Rebecca," he said after a long pause, his voice lower than she remembered. She raised an eyebrow. "Henry." Silence stretched between them. Henry exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He faltered, then cleared his throat. I need to talk to you. Rebecca folded her hands on the table, tilting her head slightly. About what? His jaw clenched, as if the words physically hurt him. About us. A slow smile crept onto her lips. Us. There was no us anymore. I didn't realize there was still an us to talk about, she said smoothly. Henry's gaze flickered to the designers still in the room. He shifted uncomfortably. Can we talk somewhere private? Rebecca didn't move. This is my workspace. If you have something to say, you can say it here. His nostrils flared, the first sign of the old Henry flickering beneath the surface. He wasn't used to being dismissed, least of all by her, but he had no choice. I need your help, he finally admitted. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, savoring the moment. Henry Westwood, the man who had thrown her away like she was worthless, was now standing in front of her, asking for help. How poetic. She crossed her legs, watching him. Help with what? Henry hesitated. He hated this. She could see it in the way his hands clenched at his sides, the way his pride was warring with his desperation. I lost everything, he said finally. Rebecca feigned surprise. Oh, his jaw tightened. The company, the house, my assets, it's all gone. Rebecca let that sink in for a moment. The mighty Henry Westwood had fallen. She should have felt pity once, she might have, but now all she felt was justice. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. And what does that have to do with me? Henry's lips parted slightly, as if he hadn't expected her to be so indifferent. He had expected warmth, forgiveness, maybe even a lingering sense of loyalty, but he had killed that a long time ago. I need a fresh start, he said, his voice quieter now. I thought, maybe we could talk. Maybe we could fix things. Rebecca's fingers drummed lightly against the table. Fix things. Where was this energy when she had been begging him to stay by her side? Where was this desperation when she had needed him the most? She let the silence stretch before speaking. You didn't want me when I needed you. Henry, she said, her voice steady. You left me. You humiliated me. And now that you've lost everything, now you come crawling back. His face tightened. That's not... Let me ask you something. Rebecca leaned forward slightly. If I were still in that hospital bed, if I were still helpless, would you be here right now? Henry swallowed. Unable to answer, that was all the confirmation she needed. Rebecca let out a small, humorless laugh, shaking her head. I don't owe you anything. Henry's composure cracked. Rebecca, no. She cut him off. You made your choice, Henry. And now I'm making mine. She stood, strong, powerful, not the broken woman he had left behind. Henry stared at her, his eyes widening slightly. He had spent so long believing she would always be beneath him, but now he was the one looking up. I don't need you, Rebecca said, her voice cold and final. And I never will again. She turned her back to him, signaling the conversation was over. For a long moment, Henry didn't move. Then, without another word, he walked out. And Rebecca, she didn't look back. Henry Westwood had always been the kind of man who could walk into a room and make people turn their heads. His name had once carried power. His presence commanded respect. But now, as he stepped out of Rebecca's office and into the cold evening air, he felt invisible. People passed him on the sidewalk without a second glance. A year ago, that would have been unthinkable now. It was his reality. He shoved his hands into his pockets, his mind spinning from what had just happened. He had expected Rebecca to be angry, bitter even, but not like this. Not so untouchable. She had looked him in the eye and dismissed him like he was nothing, like he was beneath her. And the worst part, she was right. His footsteps echoed against the pavement as he walked aimlessly, the weight of his failures pressing down on him. His empire was gone, his reputation in ruins. And now, the one person he had thought he could manipulate into helping him had turned her back on him without hesitation. For the first time in his life, Henry felt truly powerless. The downward spiral didn't stop there. The next morning, he woke up in a cheap motel, the kind of place he never would have considered setting foot in before. He had no choice. His penthouse had been seized and his bank accounts were frozen. The man who once threw lavish parties in his mansion now had to decide between paying for another night in this dump or saving what little cash he had left. He turned on his phone. ignoring the dozens of missed calls from lawyers and debt collectors. Instead, he searched for news about Rebecca. There she was. Her name was all over the business headlines. Rebecca Westwood's fashion empire on the rise. The new face of inclusive fashion, from tragedy to triumph. How Rebecca Westwood defied the odds. Henry gritted his teeth as he scrolled through article after article. They praised her resilience, her talent, her ability to build something from nothing. Nothing. That was what he had called her once, and now she was worth more than he had ever been. The final blow came when he saw the announcement: Rebecca Westwood to receive prestigious business award for innovation in fashion design. The ceremony was happening in a week, the kind of ceremony he used to be invited to, the kind of stage he used to dominate. And now, it was Rebecca who would stand there, accepting an award while he rotted in obscurity. The night of the event, Henry stood outside the venue, watching from a distance. A year ago, he would have been inside, seated at the VIP table, shaking hands with the most powerful people in the industry. Now, he was an outsider, watching through the glass like a ghost haunting the life he once had. The entrance was lined with reporters, cameras flashing as Rebecca arrived. She stepped out of a sleek black car. Wearing an elegant midnight blue gown, her hair styled to perfection, she looked radiant, powerful, untouchable, and she was walking. Henry's breath caught in his throat. She wasn't using a wheelchair. She wasn't relying on anyone. Rebecca Westwood was standing tall, walking with confidence, smiling as she greeted the press. Henry staggered back, his chest tightening. She had done it. She had proven him wrong. The woman he had abandoned, the woman he had belittled, had risen from the ashes, stronger than ever. And him, he was nothing but a forgotten name, a cautionary tale of greed and arrogance. He turned away before he could see her step inside. He didn't need to watch the ceremony to know what would happen. Rebecca would be celebrated. She would give a speech, thanking those who had believed in her. She would receive a standing ovation. And Henry, no one would even remember he existed. As he walked down the empty street, his shoes scuffing against the pavement, he realized something that made his stomach twist. This was his legacy now. Not power, not wealth, not respect. His legacy was losing. And the worst part, it was all his fault. The applause echoed through the grand ballroom, filling the space with an energy that Rebecca had once only dreamed of. She stood on the stage, the golden award in her hands, the lights warm against her skin. For years, she had been nothing more than Henry Westwood's wife, a beautiful but silent presence in his world, a woman meant to be seen, not heard. Now, the entire room was listening to her. She took a slow breath, steadying herself as she looked out at the sea of faces. Some of them had ignored her in the past, whispering behind her back at events, dismissing her as just another socialite. But tonight, they saw her, really saw her. Rebecca Westwood was no longer a name attached to Henry's. She had built something of her own, and the world was paying attention. She adjusted the microphone, her voice clear and steady. A year ago, I never could have imagined standing here. In fact, a year ago, I was in a hospital bed, convinced my life was over. The audience grew silent, drawn in by her words. I lost everything I thought defined me, my independence, my strength, my sense of purpose. And for a while, I believed what people told me, that I was broken, that I had no future. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Rebecca let them settle before continuing. But then I realized something. I wasn't the one who was broken. The world around me was. A world that tells people like me that we should shrink, that we should disappear when we're no longer seen as perfect. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room. I refused to disappear. A few people clapped, and then more joined in. Rebecca smiled. I founded my company not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been told they don't belong. Because fashion isn't just about looking good, it's about feeling seen, feeling powerful, and no one should be denied that. The room erupted into applause. Rebecca exhaled, gripping the award a little tighter. This moment was hers, and nothing, not Henry, not her past, not even the doubts that once haunted her, could take it away. After the ceremony, Rebecca stood near the entrance of the ballroom, shaking hands and accepting congratulations from business executives, designers, and investors. "You were incredible up there," said Vivian Grant, a renowned designer. I'd love to discuss a potential collaboration. Rebecca smiled. I'd love that. She had spent so many years trapped in Henry's shadow, thinking she had no place in this world outside of being his wife. Now she was forging her own path, and people were seeking her out. As she turned to grab a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, she felt a presence nearby, a familiar one. She glanced toward the entrance. Henry, even in his current state, his clothes slightly wrinkled, his once arrogant posture slouched with exhaustion, he still managed to look like he belonged, or at least like he wanted to. But tonight he didn't. He was an outsider looking in. Their eyes met, and for the briefest moment, Rebecca saw something in his gaze that she had never seen before. Regret, not just the regret of losing his fortune or his reputation, regret for losing her. She held his gaze for a second longer, then turned away, as if he were no more than a stranger in a crowded room. Because that was what he was now, a stranger. Later that night, as she returned to her penthouse, the one she had bought herself, Rebecca took off her heels and sank onto the couch, exhaling deeply. The award sat on the coffee table in front of her, gleaming under the soft glow of the city lights outside. A year ago, she had been abandoned, left to believe she was worthless. Now she was a CEO, a designer, a woman who had risen. Her phone buzzed, a message from her assistant, Sophie. Numbers are in, sales skyrocketed after your speech, investors are reaching out. You did it. Rebecca smiled to herself. Yes, she did. Somewhere across the city. In a dimly lit motel room, Henry sat on the edge of a stiff mattress, staring at his reflection in the cracked mirror. He had watched her speech from a TV in the motel lobby. He had listened to every word, feeling the weight of them pressed down on him like a lead blanket. The woman he had discarded, the woman he had humiliated, had just achieved more than he ever had, and she had done it without him. No, she had done it because he had left. Henry ran a hand down his face, his mind spinning. He had always believed that people like Rebecca, people who depended on him, couldn't survive without him. But the truth was, he was the one who had never known how to survive without her. And now, it was too late. She had risen, and he had fallen so far that he wasn't sure he'd ever climb back up again. Henry sat in the corner of a nearly empty diner, staring down at the cheap cup of coffee in front of him. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a dull glow over the cracked formica table. The smell of burnt toast and stale grease filled the air. It was a far cry from the exclusive clubs and five-star restaurants he used to frequent. But this was his life now. Rock bottom, the TV mounted in the corner played a recap of Rebecca's speech from the night before. Her image filled the screen, poised, radiant, victorious. Henry couldn't tear his eyes away. He barely recognized the woman he had once controlled, once belittled. She was stronger now, powerful in a way that made his stomach twist. She had everything, and he had nothing. He clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around the ceramic mug. He had to find a way back. The next morning, Henry made a decision. He wasn't going to sit around and let himself rot in obscurity. He still had connections, people who owed him favors, old allies who might be willing to help. So he started making calls. One by one, they ignored him. The first few went straight to voicemail. Then came the polite rejections. Henry, I wish I could help, but my hands are tied. You know how it is, Westwood. Business is business. Finally, some of them stopped pretending. Why the hell would I help you, Henry? You burned every bridge you ever had. He slammed his phone onto the table. Seething, his contacts, his so-called friends, none of them would even give him the time of day. He was truly alone. Desperation led him to his last resort. His father's house, the mansion Henry had grown up in, was a relic of old money, a symbol of power and tradition as he stood outside the grand estate. He felt the familiar pang of childhood resentment. He had spent his entire life proving to his father that he was better, stronger, smarter, that he could build something bigger than the Westwood name. And now, here he was, a failure. He exhaled sharply before knocking. The butler answered, his expression carefully neutral. Mr. Westwood, I need to see my father. A long pause, then. He's not available. Henry scowled. Tell him it's important. The butler hesitated. Wait here. Minutes passed before the door finally opened again, revealing Charles Westwood, the man who had shaped Henry into who he was, cold, Ruthless. A man who valued power above all else. Charles looked him over, taking in the disheveled suit, the exhaustion in his eyes. Then, with a smirk, he stepped aside. "I was wondering when you'd come crawling back." Henry clenched his fists but forced himself to step inside. He wouldn't give his father the satisfaction of seeing him break. The study smelled of cigars and old books, just as it always had. Charles poured himself a glass of whiskey, watching his son with something between amusement and disdain. "So," he said, swirling the amber liquid, "you ruined everything." Henry's jaw tightened. "I just need a loan, a small investment to help me get back on my feet." Charles chuckled, shaking his head, still thinking like a spoiled child. Henry bristled. "I built an empire, and you destroyed it." Silence. Charles sighed, setting his glass down. "You want my help? Convince me why I should waste my money on you." Henry took a steady breath. "I still have connections. I can rebuild. I just need a chance." Charles studied him for a moment before leaning back in his chair. "Tell me something, Henry. Where is your wife?" Henry stiffened. "Rebecca is successful." Charles finished for him. "I saw the news. Quite the transformation, wouldn't you say?" Henry swallowed the bitter taste in his mouth. Charles smirked. "Let me guess. You thought she'd fall apart without you instead. She's thriving while you're standing in my house begging for scraps." Henry's fingers curled into fists. His father let out a short, humorless laugh. "And you want me to invest in you?" He shook his head. "No, Henry. I invest in winners." Henry's chest tightened. "You're just going to let me fail." Charles took a slow sip of his drink. "You already did." Something inside Henry snapped. "I am your son," he hissed, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You're supposed to stand by me." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Like you stood by Rebecca." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Henry opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His father smirked, standing. "Get out of my house, Henry. You're not worth my time." Henry's breath came shallow, his pulse roaring in his ears. His own father had turned his back on him. Without another word, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. He spent the rest of the night drinking, his mind spiraling. He had nothing left. No company, no money, no allies, no Rebecca. The thought of her, standing on that stage, walking across that ballroom, leaving him behind without a second thought, was unbearable. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered the truth. She had never needed him, but he had always needed her. And now, he had lost her forever. He downed the last of his whiskey, staring at his reflection in the dirty motel mirror. For the first time in his life, Henry Westwood had no way out, no power, no future, just the crushing weight of his own mistakes. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh coffee and new beginnings. Rebecca sat in her favorite corner of a small cafe, a warm cup in her hands, watching the city come to life. She used to dread mornings, waking up in Henry's mansion, feeling like a ghost in her own life. Now, mornings were hers. The world felt open, filled with possibilities. Her business was thriving. Investors had poured in after her award speech, and the latest collection was already selling out. Westwood Designs, a name she had debated keeping, was now synonymous with innovation and inclusivity in fashion, and she had done it without him. She should have felt completely at peace. But something still lingered, a shadow of her past that needed to be confronted, and she knew exactly where to find it. That afternoon, she took a drive to a part of the city she never thought she'd step foot in again. The motel Henry had been staying at wasn't far from the towering buildings of high society, but it felt like another world. The receptionist barely looked up as she walked in. "Room number?" She hesitated. She didn't even know if he'd still be here, but something told her he had nowhere else to go. "Henry Westwood," the woman sighed, flipping through the guest list. "Room 212. Rebecca nodded. Heading toward the worn-out staircase, her heels clicked against the linoleum floor as she reached the door. For a moment, she debated leaving. Did she really need to do this? Yes. Not for him. For her. She knocked. Silence. Then, slow, uneven footsteps. The door creaked open just enough for Henry to peer out. His bloodshot eyes widened. Rebecca. She barely recognized him. His suit was wrinkled, his once pristine hair disheveled, dark circles under his eyes. He smelled of whiskey and failure. For a fleeting moment, She almost felt pity, almost. "Are you going to invite me in?" she asked. Henry hesitated before stepping aside. The room was small and dimly lit, the air thick with stale alcohol. A half-empty bottle of whiskey sat on the nightstand, and papers were scattered across the desk. Papers that, upon closer inspection, were rejection letters from potential business partners. Rebecca took it all in, then turned to face him. "You came to see me," Henry said, his voice rough. "Yes," she said simply. His lips parted as if searching for the right words. "Why?" Rebecca exhaled, crossing her arms. "Because I need closure." He blinked, as if the word confused him. "Closure," she nodded. "For years I let you define my worth. I lived in your world, followed your rules, let you make me feel like I was less." She met his gaze, unwavering. "But I'm not less, Henry. I never was." He swallowed hard, running a hand down his face. "I know." Rebecca's brow arched slightly. "Do you?" His silence was all the answer she needed. She stepped closer, her voice softer but firm. "I used to think that if I ever saw you like this, broken, lost, that it would feel like justice, that it would satisfy me." She shook her head. "But it doesn't." Henry flinched. "Rebecca," she lifted a hand, stopping him. "You don't get to speak, Henry, not this time." He fell silent. "I loved you," she admitted, surprising even herself. "I really did. And when you abandoned me, it nearly destroyed me. But I rebuilt myself, and I did it without you." She took a step back, putting distance between them. "I don't hate you, Henry. I don't feel anything for you anymore. And that's why I came," she exhaled. "To tell you that I forgive you." His breath hitched. I forgive you," she repeated. "Not because you deserve it, but because I do." Henry's expression crumbled. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. For the first time, Rebecca saw the truth in his eyes. He wasn't just ashamed. He was afraid. Afraid of what he had lost. Afraid of what he had become. And there was nothing he could do to change it. Rebecca gave him one last look, then turned to leave. As she reached the door, she heard his voice, barely above a whisper. "Rebecca, please." She paused, her fingers resting on the doorknob. A year ago, she would have turned around. A year ago, she would have given him another chance, but not anymore. She straightened her shoulders and walked out without looking back. Henry Westwood was her past, and she had a future waiting for her. As she stepped outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the city skyline. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. She pulled out her phone and dialed Sophie. "Hey," she said, her voice light. "Clear my schedule for tomorrow." "Everything?" Sophie asked, surprised. "Yes," Rebecca said with a small smile. "I think I deserve a day off." She hung up, taking a deep breath as she let the cool air fill her lungs. This was it. This was closure, and Rebecca Westwood was finally free. The door clicked shut, and Henry stood frozen, staring at the empty space where Rebecca had just been. She had forgiven him, and then she had walked away for years. He had lived under the belief that no matter what happened, he would always have control. Over his life, over his business, over her. He had thought that she would always be there, waiting for him, longing for his approval. But she wasn't waiting anymore. She had won, and he had lost. The reality of it crushed him like an unbearable weight, pressing down on his chest until he could barely breathe. With shaking hands, he grabbed the whiskey bottle from the nightstand and took a long, desperate drink. The burn did nothing to numb the ache inside him. He staggered toward the bathroom, gripping the sink as he looked at himself in the mirror. The man staring back at him was unrecognizable. His once sharp features were worn, his skin pale and rough, his eyes bloodshot. The confident, powerful businessman Henry Westwood had been was gone. What was left was a hollow, broken man drowning in his own mistakes. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. This was his legacy, not success, not power. Failure, utter, pathetic failure. With a sudden burst of rage, he grabbed the bottle and hurled it against the mirror. The glass shattered, whiskey dripping down the cracks like golden tears. Henry braced himself against the sink, his breath ragged, his body shaking. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She wasn't supposed to leave him. She wasn't supposed to be the one who moved on, but she had. And now, no one cared about Henry Westwood anymore. He clenched his fists, his mind racing. There had to be a way back, a way to reclaim even a fraction of what he had lost. He wasn't going to rot in some rundown motel, forgotten. He couldn't. With newfound desperation, he grabbed his phone and started dialing. Someone, anyone, had to be willing to help him. But each call went straight to voicemail. Each text was left unanswered. The world had moved on without him. The days blurred together, each one heavier than the last. His savings had run out. The little money he had left from selling his watch and cufflinks barely covered food and rent. He started drinking earlier in the day, sometimes before noon. Anything to dull the crushing weight of his failure. He barely left the motel room. There was no point, until one night, when he found himself wandering the streets, lost in thought, lost in everything. Then he saw it, Rebecca's face glowing from a giant billboard, advertising her latest collection. She looked radiant, powerful, and beneath her name, the words that stung the most. Westwood Designs, a future without limits. Henry let out a bitter chuckle. A future without limits. A future without him. The world had rewritten the story. Rebecca was the success, and he was the forgotten chapter. He stumbled forward, his head spinning, not just from the alcohol, but from the sheer weight of it all. The realization that he had nothing, no company, no home, no allies, no Rebecca. His steps faltered, and for the first time in his life he wondered, what was the point? What was left? He had built an empire, only to watch it burn. He had once been on top of the world, and now he was standing on the edge of nothingness. A car horn blared, jerking him back to reality just in time to step back from the curb. A moment later, headlights rushed past him, too close for comfort. His heart pounded. For a split second, he had thought about stepping forward, just ending it all. But something inside him refused. Not like this. Not as a man who gave up. Henry Westwood had lost everything, but he wasn't dead yet. And if there was even one chance left to rebuild, to claw his way back, he was going to take it, even if it killed him. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Rebecca's penthouse, casting golden light over the sleek, modern space. The city stretched out below, a breathtaking view that reminded her every day just how far she had come. She sat at the dining table, sipping her coffee, scrolling through emails on her tablet. Another investor meeting, another opportunity, another step toward expanding Westwood Designs into something even bigger. And it was all hers. No Henry, no shadow of her past looming over her. Just Rebecca Westwood, CEO, designer, survivor. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Sophie stepped inside, her ever-efficient assistant balancing a stack of folders and her phone. "Morning, just a few updates. Your interview with Vogue is confirmed for next week, and the factory in Milan approved the latest fabric samples." Rebecca smiled, setting down her coffee. "That's great news. Oh, and there's one more thing," Sophie added a little hesitantly. "There was a call?" Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "From?" Sophie shifted uncomfortably. "Henry?" Rebecca felt the name settle over the room like a ghost. She hadn't thought about him in days, maybe even weeks. "I didn't take it," Sophie continued quickly. "But he left a message." Rebecca exhaled, setting her tablet down. "What did he say?" Sophie hesitated. "He sounded bad. Said he just wanted to talk." Rebecca sat back in her chair, considering. Henry wanted to talk. A year ago, she would have dropped everything for that call. But now, she wasn't sure she cared enough to respond. "Delete it," she said finally. Sophie blinked. "Are you sure?" Rebecca nodded. "Yes, I'm sure." There was no satisfaction in it, no triumph, just certainty. She didn't need to hear whatever Henry had to say, because she had already moved on. Later that evening, Rebecca found herself in her studio, running her fingers over fabric samples, envisioning the next line. For so long, she had believed she was meant to live in Henry's world, as his wife, his accessory. Now, she was creating something entirely her own. Her hands traced the soft material, picturing designs for women who had been overlooked by the fashion industry for too long. Women like her, the ones who had been discarded, the ones who had been told they weren't enough. She was designing for them. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. A message from Daniel Carter, the same Daniel Carter that Henry had accused her of flirting with all those months ago. The same Daniel who had always been kind when Henry wasn't looking. Dinner tomorrow. No business talk, just catching up. Rebecca smiled to herself. For the first time in a long time, she was open to the idea of something new. She typed back a simple response. "I'd like that." And with that, she turned off her phone, letting the world of Henry Westwood fade into silence. Because Rebecca Westwood's life wasn't about the past anymore. It was about everything ahead. Somewhere across the city, in a dimly lit motel room, Henry sat alone, staring at his phone. His call had gone unanswered. His message ignored. He had told himself she would respond, that she would always come back to him, even if just to hear him out. But she hadn't. And now, for the first time in his life, Henry Westwood was truly, completely alone. The world had forgotten Henry Westwood. He walked through the city, past the skyscrapers he once ruled, past the luxury stores where he had spent obscene amounts of money without a second thought. Now, he barely had enough cash for a meal. The pitying stares of strangers burned through him. Some people recognized him, a once powerful man reduced to nothing. But no one stopped to offer help. No one cared. And the ones who did care, he had driven them all away. Rebecca, her name lingered in his mind like an old wound. Raw and painful he had called her, hoping for something, even just to hear her voice, to remind himself that there was still one person in the world who remembered the man he used to be. But she hadn't answered. She hadn't even acknowledged him. That cut deeper than anything. His pride had been the last thing keeping him afloat. And now, even that was crumbling. Henry stopped in front of an office building, staring up at the polished glass windows. It was Daniel Carter's company. The same Daniel Carter he had despised for years. The same man he had once warned Rebecca about. The same man who was now, from what Henry had heard. Seeing her, Henry clenched his jaw. He didn't care about Rebecca moving on. At least that's what he told himself. What he did care about was survival. And Daniel Carter might be the only person left who could help him, even if it meant swallowing his last shred of pride. Security nearly laughed him out of the building when he arrived at the front desk. "Mr. Carter isn't available," the receptionist said, barely glancing up. "Tell him it's Henry Westwood," he insisted. The receptionist hesitated, then made a call. Henry watched her expression change slightly as she listened. Then, after a long pause, she set the phone down. "Mr. Carter will see you. 5th floor." Henry exhaled, his stomach twisting. Here we go. Daniel Carter was waiting in his office, leaning against his desk with his arms crossed. He looked every bit as powerful as Henry used to be. Polished, in control, untouchable. Henry hated him for it. "Westwood," Daniel greeted, his voice unreadable. "Didn't expect to see you here." Henry forced a smirk. "Didn't expect to be here." Daniel gestured to a chair. "Sit." Henry hesitated before lowering himself into the seat. He hated being in a position of weakness, but he had no choice. Daniel watched him, waiting. Henry cleared his throat. "I need a loan." Daniel's eyebrow lifted. "A loan?" Henry nodded. "A small investment, enough to get back on my feet." Daniel let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "You must really be desperate." Henry's fists clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." Daniel studied him for a long moment. Then he leaned forward. "You remember what you said to me, Westwood?" His voice was cool, controlled. "That night at the gala, when you saw me talking to Rebecca." Henry's stomach twisted. Daniel didn't wait for an answer. "You told her she wasn't allowed to speak to men like me." His lips curled slightly. "And now, you're sitting in my office, begging me for money." Henry swallowed hard. "That was a long time ago. Not long enough." Silence. Then, Daniel shook his head. "I don't do charity, Westwood. Especially not for men who spent years treating everyone around them like garbage." Henry felt his pulse pound in his ears. "I just need a chance," he said, his voice tight. Daniel exhaled slowly as if considering. Then, with a smirk, he leaned back. "All right, here's my offer." Henry sat up straighter. "I'll give you a job." Henry blinked. "A job?" Daniel nodded. "Entry level, no executive titles, no special treatment." Henry's pride screamed in protest. An entry-level job for a man who had once run a billion-dollar empire. He felt sick. Daniel watched him, waiting for his reaction. "That's the deal. Take it or leave it." Henry's throat tightened. He wanted to refuse. He wanted to spit out some sharp remark and walk out with his dignity intact, but he had nothing left. No money, no options, and if he didn't accept this, he might never recover. He exhaled slowly, forcing the words out. "I'll take it." Daniel smirked. "Good. You start Monday." Then, as if dismissing him, he turned his attention to a stack of papers on his desk. Henry stood, swallowing the last of his pride. As he walked toward the door, Daniel's voice stopped him. "Oh, and Henry?" Henry turned. Daniel's smirk deepened. "Rebecca's better off without you." Henry's hands curled into fists, but he didn't argue, because deep down, he knew Daniel was right. Monday morning arrived too quickly. Henry stood outside Carter Enterprises, staring up at the sleek glass building that now held his fate in its hands. The irony was almost unbearable. He had once dismissed this company as insignificant, laughing at the idea that Daniel Carter would ever be a real competitor. Now it was the only place willing to give him a job. He inhaled deeply, adjusting the second-hand suit he had bought with what little money he had left. It didn't fit quite right. The sleeves slightly too long, the fabric not as fine as what he was used to. He hated how unfamiliar he looked, but this was his life now. Swallowing his pride, he walked through the revolving doors. The receptionist barely looked up as she directed him to HR. "No, Mr. Westwood, welcome to the office. No special treatment, just another employee." By the time he was handed his security badge, one that labeled him Henry Westwood, Junior Associate, he felt physically ill. "Your department supervisor will be expecting you," the HR manager said, barely glancing at him before moving on to another new hire. Henry clenched his jaw and made his way to the designated floor. He had imagined a small private office, maybe not as grand as his old one, but something that at least acknowledged who he was. Instead, he was led to an open-plan workspace. Rows of desks filled with people tapping away on computers, taking phone calls, completely indifferent to his arrival. No one turned to look at him. No one cared. "Westwood," a voice called. He turned to see a man in his mid-30s walking toward him, holding a file. He wore a simple button-down and slacks. Nothing flashy, nothing expensive. "Travis Cooper, I'm your supervisor." The man extended a hand, his expression neutral. Henry hesitated before shaking it. Travis didn't bother with pleasantries. He handed Henry the file. "Your first assignment, data entry. All the instructions are in there." Henry blinked. "Data entry?" Travis nodded. "You got a problem with that?" Henry gritted his teeth. He had been CEO of one of the most powerful corporations in the country. He had managed billion-dollar deals, dictated the course of industries, and now they had him doing data entry, but he had no choice. "Understood," he muttered. Travis smirked slightly, as if amused by Henry's discomfort. "Good. Welcome to the team." Then he walked off, leaving Henry standing in the middle of the floor, holding a folder that felt heavier than it should. He sat down at his assigned desk, the chair stiff and uncomfortable. For a long moment, he just stared at the computer screen. This was his life now. A man who once controlled everything, reduced to a nameless employee in a company he used to mock. His hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to open the file, and he started typing. Days turned into weeks, and Henry quickly realized that his name meant nothing here. No one cared that he used to be powerful. No one cared that he had once been untouchable. Here, he was just another worker. The office culture was nothing like what he was used to. There were no extravagant displays of power, no cutthroat tactics to dominate the competition. People actually collaborated. It was nauseating, but what was worse, no one feared him. People talked to him like he was normal. They asked about his weekend, cracked jokes, invited him to lunch. At first, he ignored them. He kept his head down, did his work, and left as soon as his shift was over. But isolation in the office was just as suffocating as it was outside of it. And eventually, he found himself responding. He didn't know when it started. Maybe it was the day Sarah from accounting brought him an extra coffee without asking, or when Louise from marketing pulled him into a conversation about baseball, not caring that Henry barely followed sports anymore. It was small things, simple things. But for the first time in his life, Henry was interacting with people who didn't want something from him, who didn't fear him, who saw him, not as Henry Westwood, the former tycoon, but as just Henry. It was disorienting, and strangely, it was the only thing keeping him from completely unraveling. One night after another exhausting day, Henry found himself walking instead of taking a cab. He didn't have money to waste, and the fresh air was better than going straight back to his cramped motel room. The city had changed, or maybe he had. He passed by the places he once owned, the restaurants where his presence used to guarantee the best table. Now, he was just another person on the sidewalk, unnoticed and unimportant. He should have hated it, but instead he felt something else. Relief. He shook the thought away. Then, as he turned the corner, he saw a familiar sign. A boutique, Westwood Designs. His heart twisted. Rebecca's store, her dream. Now a reality. Through the window, he could see the mannequins dressed in her latest collection. Elegant, sleek, and most importantly, inclusive. Designs that were functional without sacrificing style, made for people who had been ignored by the industry for too long. People like her. She had built something real, something bigger than him, and she had done it without him. He exhaled, stepping back from the glass. For months, he had been consumed with the idea of reclaiming what he lost. But standing there, looking at the proof of Rebecca's success, something finally clicked. Maybe he wasn't supposed to reclaim anything. Maybe this wasn't about getting back to who he was. Maybe it was about becoming someone new. The thought terrified him, but for the first time in his life, it also gave him something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The boutique was buzzing with life. Rebecca moved between racks of clothing. Checking the final touches on her latest collection, customers browsed through the designs, chatting excitedly, and her employees handled each guest with warmth and professionalism. This was everything she had envisioned. Westwood Designs wasn't just a brand. It was a statement. A reminder that beauty and accessibility weren't mutually exclusive. She had built something real, something that mattered, and she had done it on her own. As she greeted a longtime client, the bell above the door chimed, signaling a new arrival. Rebecca turned, expecting to see another customer. Instead, she froze. Henry. Her breath caught for just a second, barely noticeable to anyone else. But inside, it felt like a lifetime. He looked different, not just physically, though that was obvious. He was thinner. His suit was off the rack instead of custom-made, and there was an exhaustion in his posture that hadn't been there before. But it was something deeper. The arrogance was gone. The smug superiority that had once clung to him like expensive cologne had been stripped away. He looked human. Their eyes met. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then Rebecca straightened her shoulders. "Henry," he swallowed, his throat working like he was searching for words he hadn't rehearsed. "Rebecca." The energy in the store shifted. A few employees noticed, sneaking, cautious glances between them. The tension in the air was undeniable, but Rebecca refused to let it shake her. She turned to one of her assistants. "Could you excuse us for a moment?" The woman nodded quickly, stepping away. Rebecca folded her arms, keeping her expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" Henry let out a slow breath. He hesitated. Then, with an honesty she hadn't expected, he said, "I don't know." She arched an eyebrow. "That's a first." A ghost of a smirk flickered across his lips. But it didn't last. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I saw the store. He trailed off again, shaking his head. Rebecca studied him. This wasn't the Henry she had once known. That Henry never hesitated, never admitted uncertainty. This Henry, he looked lost. She should have felt satisfaction, maybe even triumph. But instead, all she felt was curiosity. "Are you looking for something, Henry?" she asked, her tone measured. He hesitated again. "No," he said finally. "Not really." Rebecca gave a small nod. "Then I don't see why you're here." Silence. Henry's gaze drifted around the boutique, taking in the displays, the fabrics, the name on the wall. Her name. She could see it in his eyes, the realization of what she had built, the weight of what he had lost. "It suits you," he murmured. Rebecca tilted her head. "What?" "This." He gestured around the store. "All of it. It suits you." She hadn't expected that. She had expected excuses, justifications, maybe even a plea for another chance, but not acknowledgement, not respect, not... She took a slow breath. "It does." Silence stretched between them again, but it wasn't as tense as before. It was just there. Finally, Henry cleared his throat. "I should go." Rebecca didn't stop him. As he turned toward the door, she spoke. "Henry." He paused. She met his gaze, her voice soft but firm. "I really do hope you find what you're looking for." Something flickered in his expression, something she couldn't quite name. Then, with a nod, he walked out. The bell chimed again as the door closed behind him. Rebecca exhaled slowly. That was it, the final chapter of Henry Westwood in her life. She turned back to her employees, straightening her posture, already shifting her focus back to her work, because her future was waiting, and it had nothing to do with him. Outside, Henry walked aimlessly, hands in his pockets, the city moving around him for so long. He had convinced himself that he needed Rebecca's forgiveness to move forward. But now, he realized, he needed to forgive himself for everything, and that was going to be the hardest thing he had ever done. Henry sat on a park bench, staring out at the city skyline. The lights of New York flickered in the distance, vibrant and full of life. But for the first time in his existence, Henry Westwood didn't feel like he belonged to that world anymore. It had been weeks since he walked into Rebecca's boutique, weeks since he really realized, that she had moved on and that he had to do the same. But moving on meant something different now. It wasn't about clawing his way back to power or reclaiming what he had lost. It was about becoming someone new. For the first time in his life, Henry Westwood had no blueprint, no master plan, just himself. His days at Carter Enterprises were still a struggle. The work was menial. The pay was barely enough to get by. And every now and then, someone would recognize him, whispering behind his back, "That's Henry Westwood. Can you believe it? He used to be a billionaire." Henry heard every word, and every time, it burned. But instead of snapping back, instead of carrying himself with the arrogance that had once defined him, he let it go, because deep down, he knew they were right. He had been a billionaire. He had been powerful. And now, he was just another guy trying to survive. And maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. One evening, as he packed up his things after another exhausting day, his supervisor, Travis, walked by his desk. "Westwood," Travis said. Henry looked up, expecting another sarcastic remark, but instead, Travis tossed a file onto his desk. "What's this?" Henry asked. "Your next assignment?" Henry flipped through the pages. It wasn't data entry this time. It was research, market trends, projections, strategy proposals. He looked up confused. Travis smirked. "You used to run a company, right? Let's see if you actually learned anything." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Why are you giving me this?" Travis shrugged. "Because you stopped acting like an entitled prick." Henry let out a short laugh. "Fair enough." Travis nodded, then walked off. Henry stared at the file for a long moment. It wasn't much, but it was something, a step forward. That weekend, Henry found himself standing outside a bookstore. He hadn't stepped inside one in years, but tonight, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he did. He wandered through the aisles, running his fingers over the spines of books about leadership, finance, personal growth, and then he saw it. A magazine, Forbes. Rebecca was on the cover. Rebecca Westwood, the woman redefining fashion. Henry exhaled slowly. He picked it up, flipping to the article. It spoke about her journey, her resilience, her vision. And there, in the middle of it, was a line that hit him harder than anything else. "I spent so much of my life being defined by someone else's expectations now. I define myself." Henry closed the magazine, setting it back on the shelf. He wasn't part of her story anymore, and that was okay, because for the first time in his life, he was ready to write his own. Months passed. Henry worked harder than he ever had, slowly climbing his way up at Carter Enterprises, not because he wanted power, not because he wanted revenge, but because he wanted to prove, to himself, to the world, that he wasn't just the man who had fallen. He was the man who could rebuild. It wasn't easy, but nothing worth having ever was. One evening, after an especially grueling day, Henry found himself walking past a familiar cafe, the same cafe where Rebecca used to go in the mornings. For a split second, he considered walking in, seeing if she was there, but then he stopped. He didn't need to see her. He didn't need closure because he had already found it. With a small smile, he turned and walked away. For the first time in his life, Henry Westwood wasn't chasing anything. He was just moving forward, and that was enough.